Maduro challenges the United States again, and the worst happens in the war. The Venezuelan president is ready to take a highly defiant step, one that would make Donald Trump absolutely furious. And all this is happening right now, at this very moment, while American warships are on a collision course with Venezuela. And that's not all. Nicolas Maduro just crossed a line that no Venezuelan leader had ever crossed before. And Washington is responding with an unimaginable military escalation. Is conflict in the Americas inevitable? That's what you're about to find out in this video. 2025, Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez announced something historic during a meeting with the diplomatic corps in Caracas. Maduro had signed a decree of external commotion, a constitutional measure that hadn't been used since the current Venezuelan constitution was approved more than 25 years ago. But what exactly does this decree mean? That's where things get really concerning. According to Venezuela's constitution, a state of external commotion can be declared when there's a conflict that puts the nation's security in serious danger. And when this decree is activated, the president gets almost total political, economic, and social powers over the country. Juan Carlos Apitz, Dean of the Faculty of Legal and Political Sciences at the Central University of Venezuela, explained that this measure implies restrictions on constitutional guarantees. The law on states of exception gives the president the broadest powers imaginable, although some fundamental guarantees, such as the right to life, the ban on torture, and due process, remain protected, at least on paper. The decree hasn't yet been officially published in Venezuela's official gazette, which means Venezuelan citizens don't know exactly which rights might be restricted. The NGO Acceso a la Justicia warned that it's extremely serious that the document hasn't been released because no one knows for sure which guarantees are being limited at this moment. The decree would be triggered immediately if there's any kind of aggression against Venezuela. And when we say any kind, we're talking about an extremely broad trigger that can be interpreted in many different ways by the Venezuelan government. Now, let's break down what exactly Maduro could do if this decree is fully activated. And believe me, the list is long and frightening. First, Maduro can mobilize the Bolivarian National Armed Forces throughout Venezuelan territory without needing legislative approval or consulting his ministers. That means he can order large-scale military movements with just a direct command. Second, the Venezuelan president can immediately take military control of all the country's public service infrastructure. We're talking electricity, water, telecommunications, transportation, and any service deemed essential. Companies would simply lose operational control of their facilities. Third, Maduro can take over the hydrocarbon industry, which is the heart of Venezuela's economy, along with basic industries considered strategic. Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and this direct control would let the government redirect all production according to its military and political needs. Fourth, the decree allows for closing land, sea, and air borders. That means Venezuela could completely isolate itself from the outside world, blocking entry and exit of people, goods, and even humanitarian aid. Fifth, Maduro can activate all kinds of economic, political, and social plans to guarantee what the government calls national life. That's vague language that could include practically any imaginable measure from food rationing to requisition of private property. And sixth, maybe the most controversial of all, the government can impose mandatory military conscription and expropriate private property for an alleged fight against foreign forces. That means ordinary citizens could be forced to serve in the armed forces, and businesses or homes could be confiscated in the name of national defense. Lawyer Juan Carlos Apitz pointed out that the government could take extraordinary measures not just in the event of a real attack, but as long as it manages to justify its actions against some perceived threat. To understand why Maduro made this drastic decision, we need to go back a few weeks and look at what the United States has been doing in the Caribbean. At the end of August 2025, the Trump administration sent 8 warships and a nuclear-powered submarine to Caribbean waters, specifically near Venezuela. Washington said the goal was to fight drug trafficking leaving the Venezuelan coast toward the United States. But the situation escalated quickly. On September 2nd, Donald Trump announced at a press conference that U.S. forces had carried out a lethal strike against a vessel allegedly transporting drugs from Venezuelan territory. The American president was blunt. "We just shot a boat loaded with drugs, lots of drugs." Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed the operation on social media, describing it as a deliberate strike against what he called a drug ship. That was only the first of a series of attacks. In the following weeks, at least 3 other vessels were hit by U.S. military operations in the Caribbean Sea. In total, 14 people were killed in these actions. And here's the crucial detail. the White House presented no concrete evidence or intelligence confirming that all those killed were really criminals involved in drug trafficking. On top of the ships, the United States also sent F-35 fighter jets to an airbase in Puerto Rico, ramping up the military presence in the region. Washington claims these aircraft would be used in operations against drug cartels in the Caribbean, but for the Venezuelan government, this is a clear military threat. Trump and his Secretary of State have been particularly aggressive in their statements. They describe Maduro as the leader of a narco-state and allege that high-ranking Venezuelan officials run what they call the Cartel of the Suns, a supposed drug trafficking organization tied to the government. International security experts, however, question this simplistic narrative, arguing that the drug trafficking situation in the region is much more complex than the Trump administration suggests. Faced with this U.S. military escalation, Venezuela didn't just sit back. Maduro called on the population to enlist in the military reserves and ordered armed forces drills, along with emergency simulations across the country. On September 23rd, a large civic military mobilization took place on Bolivar Avenue in Caracas. Thousands of people marched in an act the government described as proof the country is ready to defend itself. Maduro declared during the event, "We are preparing on 3 fronts: the integral defense of a nation, the active resistance of the people, and the permanent offensive of an entire country." The Venezuelan president has ramped up his nationalist rhetoric. In a recent speech, he stated categorically that we will never be a backyard, a colony, or slaves of any supremacist empire. Maduro went further and invoked the spirit of liberator Simón Bolívar, suggesting that an aggression against Venezuela would unite all of South America in an army of liberators against what he called imperialist aggression. Venezuela also took the case to the United Nations. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Iván Gil privately met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to denounce U.S. military maneuvers in the Caribbean. According to Maduro, there was good feedback in this meeting, although no concrete details on possible UN action were revealed. Caracas has insisted that any military aggression against Venezuela would have consequences far beyond its borders, affecting all of Latin America and potentially even the United States itself. These statements may sound exaggerated, but they reflect Venezuela's view that any armed conflict in the region could destabilize the geopolitical balance of the entire American continent. The official U.S. response to Maduro's decree has been relatively restrained in public terms, but actions speak louder than words. The Trump administration hasn't backed down an inch from its militarized posture in the Caribbean. The U.S. government sticks to the narrative that its military operations in the region are solely focused on fighting drug trafficking. Marco Rubio, the Cuban-American Secretary of State, known for his hardline stance against socialist regimes in Latin America, has been particularly vocal in accusing Maduro of running a narco-state. In press statements, Rubio described Venezuelan actions as desperate attempts by an illegitimate regime to stay in power. He characterized the external commotion decree as a tool of internal repression disguised as a defensive measure, arguing that Maduro uses the supposed U.S. threat to justify consolidating authoritarian powers. From a diplomatic standpoint, Washington hasn't recognized Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president since the contested elections of 2024, when opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez was recognized by several countries as the true winner of the vote. For the United States, any decree signed by Maduro holds no constitutional legitimacy. Still, U.S. foreign policy analysts are split on whether this military escalation is wise. Some argue the operations in the Caribbean are a necessary show of force against drug trafficking and hostile regimes. Others warn that this confrontational approach could lead to unintended consequences, including the possibility of an armed conflict that neither side really wants. But here comes the most delicate and worrying part of the whole situation. How exactly could a conflict between the United States and Venezuela escalate into something much more serious? The first escalation scenario involves an unintended incident. With U.S. warships operating close to Venezuelan territorial waters and Venezuelan armed forces on high alert, there's a risk of a misunderstanding spiraling out of control. A Venezuelan ship intercepted by U.S. forces, a warning shot misinterpreted, or even an accident involving civilian vessels could ignite a much larger military crisis. The second scenario involves the possibility of the U.S. deciding to carry out military operations on Venezuelan soil, not just in international waters. Trump has already shown willingness to use lethal force in the region, and some members of his administration have publicly advocated for more aggressive actions against what they call Venezuelan narco-terrorism. If Washington decides to strike targets inside Venezuela, claiming they're drug trafficker bases, Maduro would have justification to fully activate his external commotion decree and respond militarily. The third scenario, and maybe the most dangerous, involves the internationalization of the conflict. Venezuela maintains close relations with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. While it's unlikely these countries would intervene directly with troops, they could provide logistical support, weapons, and intelligence to Venezuela. That would turn a regional conflict into a confrontation among major powers, something with global ramifications. The fourth scenario involves humanitarian and migration consequences. Venezuela is already going through a severe economic and humanitarian crisis, and any armed conflict would make it drastically worse. Millions of Venezuelans could be forced to flee, triggering an unprecedented refugee crisis in Latin America. Neighboring countries, especially Colombia and Brazil, are already struggling with Venezuelan migration, and a war could destabilize the entire region. Economically, a conflict would also have global consequences. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. Any disruption in Venezuelan oil production or exports, even though the country currently produces far below its maximum capacity, would impact global energy markets at a time when the world economy is already facing uncertainty. International relations experts note that neither side really wants a full-scale war. The U.S. would struggle to justify a complete military intervention in Venezuela without international support, especially given opposition from countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia to any military action in the region. And Venezuela, despite its fiery rhetoric, knows it doesn't have the military capacity to face the U.S. in a prolonged conflict. But here's the problem. Conflicts don't always happen because someone planned them, but because tense situations spiral out of control faster than diplomats can manage them. And right now, we've got all the ingredients for one of those situations: intensified military presence, heated rhetoric on both sides, limited diplomatic channels, and a history of misunderstandings and deep mistrust. The international community has been following these developments with growing concern. Brazil, under any government, traditionally defends non-intervention and diplomatic solutions to conflicts in Latin America. Brasilia has already publicly expressed opposition to any military action in the region and has offered dialogue channels to de-escalate tensions. Colombia, which shares a long border with Venezuela, is particularly worried about the consequences of any conflict. Bogotá already struggles with Venezuelan migrant flows and with controlling border areas where armed groups operate. A war would dramatically worsen those problems. Mexico has also spoken against any military intervention in Venezuela, reaffirming its traditional stance of respecting sovereignty and non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs. The Mexican position is especially significant given its own tensions with the Trump administration on various issues. On the multilateral stage, the Organization of American States remains divided on the Venezuelan issue, with some countries supporting tougher positions against Maduro, while others push for dialogue. That division reflects the different ideological views and geopolitical interests across Latin America. Russia and China, meanwhile, have consistently backed Venezuela in international forums and condemned what they describe as U.S. regime change attempts. Moscow has provided military support to Venezuela in the past, including aircraft, air defense systems, and technical advisors. Beijing maintains significant economic interests in the country, especially in the oil sector, and has granted substantial loans and investments to the Venezuelan government. The consequences of this tension go way beyond Venezuela and the United States. All of Latin America is watching closely what happens in the Caribbean because the outcome of this crisis will set important precedents for hemispheric relations in the coming years. If the U.S. goes ahead with more aggressive military actions against Venezuela, it could encourage similar moves against other governments Washington considers problematic in the region. On the other hand, if Maduro manages to withstand U.S. pressure and keep his government in power, it could embolden other authoritarian leaders clashing with the United States. The crisis also exposes deep divisions within Latin America over how to deal with Venezuela. While some countries want Maduro out of power by any means necessary, others fear the consequences of external intervention and prefer gradual approaches of diplomatic and economic pressure. For ordinary Venezuelan citizens, this military escalation means more uncertainty in a country already facing one of the worst humanitarian and economic crises in recent Latin American history. Millions of Venezuelans have already left the country in recent years, seeking better living conditions. An armed conflict could trigger a new mass exodus that will test the capacity of neighboring countries to absorb refugees. We're looking at one of the most delicate geopolitical situations in Latin America in decades. The external commotion decree signed by Maduro isn't just a legal document, it's a statement that Venezuela is ready to respond to any action it considers an aggression. And with U.S. ships patrolling the Caribbean and having already carried out lethal strikes in the region, the gap between rhetoric and real action is dangerously narrow. The big question now is whether diplomatic channels can prevail over military escalation. History teaches us that armed conflicts are much easier to start than to end, and their consequences often go way beyond what either side initially imagined. What makes this situation particularly worrisome is that both sides have internal political incentives to hold firm positions. Trump wants to show strength against what he calls the Venezuelan narco-state and please his political base that supports tough action against socialist regimes. Maduro needs to keep his narrative of resisting American imperialism to consolidate domestic support and justify the country's economic hardships. In the coming weeks and months, every ship movement, every public statement, every military drill will be carefully watched by analysts worldwide, trying to assess whether we're heading toward diplomatic de-escalation or something much more dangerous. What happens between the U.S. and Venezuela doesn't stay just between the U.S. and Venezuela. The ripple effects of this potential conflict could reach all of Latin America, shake global energy markets, and test the international security architecture built after the Second Great World Confrontation. For now, Maduro's decree remains signed but not fully activated, like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. U.S. warships keep patrolling the Caribbean, and the world watches, hoping reason and diplomacy prevail over confrontation and force. This is a story that's only beginning, and whose ending is yet to be written. What we can say for sure is that the next few weeks will be decisive in determining whether we're heading toward a diplomatic solution or a crisis that could change the balance of power across the entire Western Hemisphere.